The air was cold before the sun. In the highlands of feudal Japan, silence came before everything, before prayer, before orders, before steel. There was no room for dreams here, not in the world Katsuro inhabited. Dreams were for poets. For samurai, there was only the day, what it demanded, and what it allowed you to survive. Katsuro opened his eyes before the first bird called through the trees. His sleeping mat was firm. The room smelled of cedar, sit, and discipline. There were no distractions here. No comforts. Just clean lines, folded garments, and the solemn watch of ancestors whose wooden memorial tablets faced him from the altar. They were the only eyes he answered to. This was no palace. It was a warrior's chamber, part of a larger estate in a quiet mountain province controlled by Lord Matsunaga. Katsuro served him not out of ambition but birthright. His father had done the same. So had his grandfather. And now at 31, Katsuro lived the code passed down to him with the same cold fidelity he gave to his blade. He rose without sound, rolling his mat with precision. He stepped onto the wooden floor, which creaked softly beneath his bare feet. The cold struck quickly, but he welcomed it. A samurai did not begin the day with warmth. He began it with clarity. And nothing cleared the mind like water. Outside, the estate remained still. The lanterns had burned low through the night. Faint outlines of pine and cherry trees cut across the edge of the property, their branches moving gently in the pre-dawn wind. Beyond them lay the hills, the forests, and then the villages, where peasants were already stirring, unaware that their protector had awoken to the same sun, under vastly different expectations. Katsuro moved toward the well in the courtyard. The water was ice-cold, pulled from the mountain spring that ran beneath the estate. He scooped it without hesitation, poured it over his head, and stood still as it ran down his face and spine. His breath sharpened. His mind steadied. This was not cleansing for cleanliness' sake. It was ritual. It was control. Purity was the foundation of action. Back inside, he dressed slowly. First the fundoshi, then the kimono, then the deep blue hakama trousers, tied precisely, not tightly. Over this, his uwagi, the thick jacket worn by warriors in training. On ceremonial days, he would wear armor. On campaign days, leather and plate. But today was for practice, oversight, and study. For presence. And so, cloth and calm would suffice. He knelt before the family altar again, lighting a stick of incense. Smoke rose in steady, disciplined spirals. His prayer was brief, not a plea, but a reminder to act with courage, to speak with sincerity, and to die with honor if called. When he stood, he turned to the sword. His daisho, the paired katana and wakizashi, rested on their stand. The blades were immaculately clean. He did not draw them. Not yet. A drawn sword was a promise. And not all promises should be made lightly. Instead, he strapped both weapons to his side, adjusting his obi to balance the weight perfectly. The katana's curve followed the line of his hip. His left hand hovered above the hilt not as a reflex, but as nature. He was never without it. Not in the estate. Not at meals. Not even while sleeping. A warrior was only partly man. The rest was blade. By the time the sun finally rose, casting warm gold across the estate roof tiles, Katsuro had already begun his rounds. Servants bowed low as he passed, never speaking unless spoken to. Younger retainers, a shigaru, scribes, even pages, stepped back respectfully. He was not their lord. But his presence carried authority sharpened by silence. He made no dramatic entrances. He did not shout orders. His leadership was not loud. It was studied, cold, centered, and it began every day before the world even remembered it was spinning. The dojo was awake before the village, before the household, before the birds. It existed as a world within a world, governed by rules even stricter than the estate itself. Here, etiquette was absolute. Every bow, every step, every breath was accounted for. The sword was not simply a tool, it was a reflection. And Katsuro's reflection had to remain flawless. He arrived in silence, slipping off his sandals and stepping onto the wooden floor with bare feet. The boards had been worn smooth by generations of warriors before him. Their sweat and discipline lived in the grain, in every nail. This was not a training hall. It was a shrine to precision. A group of Ashigaru were already lined up, kneeling in rows. They were young, too young to know what it truly meant to carry a sword, but old enough to begin. Their eyes followed Katsuro as he approached, though none dared speak. Their instructor, an older samurai named Takeda, bowed deeply as Katsuro entered. He did not interrupt. He did not command. He simply watched. Takeda called the group to attention. The trainees rose in unison, forming two lines. Today's focus: basic kenjutsu, sword forms, cutting techniques, posture. The students drew their bakken, wooden training swords, and assumed their stances. Katsuro studied each one with a gaze like flint. A foot slightly off-center, a wrist too loose, a hip out of balance. Each flaw, however small, was an opening in combat. And in combat, an opening was a death sentence. After a round of katas, Takeda nodded toward Katsuro. Without a word, he stepped forward. He didn't use a bakken. He used a sheathed katana, moving with a stillness so deliberate it silenced the entire hall. He demonstrated Aido, the art of drawing and cutting in a single, fluid movement. His sword never left its scabbard, but his presence filled the room. In one motion, he stepped forward, shifted his hip, and drew. The hiss of steel split the silence like thunder in snow. The cut ended in midair. Perfect, controlled, deadly. He returned the blade as fast as it had appeared. The students exhaled collectively. What they saw wasn't speed. It was intent, the economy of motion, the removal of everything unnecessary. It wasn't about strength. It was about eliminating hesitation. He repeated the movement once more, then again, then handed his sword to Takeda and stepped back. The lesson had been made without a single word. Afterward came the archery field. Katsuro changed into his Kyudo uniform, wide-sleeved robe, white hakama, and tall black eboshi cap. He stood at the range, his longbow, the yumi, as tall as he was. It was asymmetrical, curving near the base, built from laminated bamboo. A weapon of paradox. Fragile and deadly, elegant and terrifying. He knocked the arrow, drew the string with his thumb using a yugate glove, and paused. This moment mattered most. Not the release, but the decision to release. Every movement until now had been preparation. The real test came at the threshold between tension and action. He loosed. The arrow flew clean across the field, splitting the target cleanly at center. 3 more arrows. 3 perfect shots. He didn't celebrate. He simply retrieved them, adjusted his sleeve, and continued. The rest of the morning alternated between kata repetition and sparring drills. Katsuro sparred with both experienced retainers and trainees, switching between sword and staff, longbow and hand-to-hand. He corrected stances, blocked strikes, demonstrated wrist control. He bled once, from a lucky strike to the shoulder, but didn't flinch. Blood was not failure. Only hesitation was. By midday, his robe was soaked in sweat, and his body hummed with sharp exhaustion. It was a good exhaustion, the kind that reminded him his flesh was still human, still fallible. The samurai did not train for sport. He trained for readiness, because battle never arrived with a schedule. Before leaving the dojo, he knelt in the seiza position, closed his eyes and bowed low to the floor, not to the instructor, not to the students, but to the discipline itself, to mastery always out of reach, to perfection never attained, to the path unending. The sword was sheathed, the sweat had dried, the body had been tested. Now it was the mind's turn. Katsuro returned to the eastern wing of the estate, where the stone path narrowed and the noise of servants faded into distance. This was a quieter place, a sacred one. Here there were no weapons, no armor racks, no war banners. Only paper, ink, scrolls, silence. He stepped through the sliding doors into the small study chamber, where natural light filtered in through rice paper walls. The scent of incense lingered faintly from morning prayers. A single cushion sat at the center of the room beside a low lacquered desk. A brush, an inkstone, and folded sheets of washi paper waited patiently. They had not moved. They did not age. They simply awaited use. Katsuro removed his outer robe and knelt slowly, folding his legs beneath him in seiza. The floor was cool against his knees. Before he touched the brush, he closed his eyes and breathed. His breathing slowed, deepened, for seconds in, for seconds out. Not forced, not strained, just present. He emptied the noise, let thoughts drift past like clouds. If the dojo was where he faced others, this room was where he faced himself. The first part of mental training was not knowledge. It was clarity. Before you can lead men, you must first govern yourself. That governance began here, After several minutes, he opened his eyes and reached for the brush. He dipped it into the black ink, holding it lightly, delicately, like a bird in his hand. Then he began to write. Not orders, not reports, calligraphy. Each stroke of the brush was deliberate, measured, alive. He wrote characters not for communication, but for form. The kanji flowed like water. One stroke incorrect, and the beauty was broken. One lapse in pressure, and the balance was lost. It was not unlike swordplay, only the medium had changed. The character he began with was Kokoroshin, heart, mind, spirit. 3 simple strokes, but none of them simple. He repeated the character a dozen times, not to perfect it, but to submit to it, to be humbled by it. When he was finished, he cleaned the brush and turned to the wooden shelf behind him. Rows of scrolls stood in ordered lines. Many were texts passed down from previous generations, works on Bushido, Chinese philosophy, poetry, tactics, herbal medicine, Buddhist sutras. Today, he chose a passage from the Analects of Confucius. The gentleman devotes himself to the roots. Once the roots are established, the way will grow. Filial piety and fraternal respect are the root of humanity. He read the passage aloud once, then again silently. He had memorized most of it years ago, but memorization was not understanding. Repetition was not wisdom. He let the words settle like stones in water. Katsuro believed in learning not because it elevated him, but because it restrained him. In war, he was expected to kill. In politics, to command. But the mind kept him from becoming a weapon without a soul. He often taught this to his students, the younger Ashigaru and junior samurai who came seeking sword technique but were bored by the quiet hours of study. He would make them write, make them sit, make them think. Most resisted. A few understood. Those were the ones he trusted to lead. By mid-afternoon, the study session ended. He bowed to the shelf of scrolls, folded his calligraphy, and extinguished the candle now burning low beside the desk. The silence was complete, not sterile but earned. He left the study chamber as he had entered it. Calm, precise, silent. Outside, the world had changed. The estate was alive again. The sound of workers moving straw, the hammering of repairs in the stable, the calls of children playing near the garden wall. Life was moving forward, but Katsuro's steps remained unhurried. His mind was no sharper than his blade, and both were ready. The sword was sharp, the mind was clear. Now came the most delicate task of all, judgment. In the afternoon, Katsuro left the quiet of his study and stepped into the compound's administrative hall. A low wooden building with wide eaves and an open floor plan. This was not a place for meditation. This was the engine room of estate governance, where disputes were heard, taxes collected, punishments assigned, and law kept alive by the will of men with steady hands. A small group was already waiting. Farmers, village elders, and retainers sat quietly along the outer edge of the chamber. None met Katsuro's eyes. Not from fear, but from discipline. To bring a matter before a samurai was not a right. It was a request to be seen, to be heard, and to accept the consequences of that hearing. Katsuro removed his sandals and took his position at the raised platform. He knelt, legs folded tightly beneath him, hands on his thighs. A single wooden tablet, lacquered black, sat before him. It bore no writing. It needed none. Its presence alone was authority. To the left sat 2 scribes ready with brushes and scrolls. Their task was not to speak, but to record. What was decided here would echo down into the village, carried by messengers and memory alike. The first case was presented by a village elder, an old man with a weathered face and a voice like wind through reeds. 2 families had disputed a boundary line between their rice paddies. Each claimed the other had moved the stones. Neither had witnesses. Katsuro listened. He asked no questions. When the men finished, silence followed. It stretched long enough for sweat to form on brows. Then he spoke. The land does not speak, but men do, and they speak what benefits them. He paused, then issued a solution. The disputed strip would be split. Both families would lose ground. Fairness was not about reward, it was about sacrifice. Both men bowed, accepting the ruling. One with bitterness, the other with quiet triumph. Katsuro noticed both, said nothing. The next case was more serious. A young boy, perhaps 15, had been caught stealing dried fish from the storehouse. It was his second offense. He knelt trembling before Katsuro, flanked by 2 guards. His mother stood nearby, silent but tearful. Theft was not merely a crime, it was an insult to harmony. To steal was to disturb the balance of need and duty. But Katsuro saw something in the boy's face that others might have missed. Not defiance. Hunger. "Did you steal?" Katsuro asked. The boy bowed deeply. "Yes, master." "Why?" "My brother is sick. My mother has no coin. We had no food." The hall went still. Katsuro considered the options. Punishment would deter future thefts. Mercy might breed leniency. But this was not about numbers. This was about people. About the fragile balance between law and humanity. He ruled that the boy would work the storehouse for 1 season under supervision. No prison. No beating. But no leniency either. His labor would pay for what he took. In doing so, he would restore the harmony he had broken. His mother bowed repeatedly. The boy wept, not from fear, but from relief. The scroll recorded the judgment. The hall moved on. Katsuro presided over 4 more cases that day: disputes about water rights, timber cutting, a debt that had gone unpaid, and a minor case of assault during a dice game. Each ruling required more than knowledge. It demanded intuition, detachment, compassion restrained by principle. When the final petitioner left, the hall emptied. Only the scribes remained, their scrolls now filled with the day's decisions. Katsuro stood slowly, stretching legs that had grown stiff from kneeling. His back ached slightly, not from age, but from tension. The sword had not been drawn today, but still, a battle had been fought. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent behind the mountains. Servants bowed as he passed, now slightly more relaxed. His presence no longer needed to cast its full weight. He paused near the courtyard well and watched a group of children chase a ball. One of them stumbled and fell. The others laughed, helped him up, and returned to the game. No scroll would ever record that moment. But for Katsuro, it was enough. Order was not built in halls. It was built in gestures, in habits, in the quiet knowledge that someone was watching even when the blade remained sheathed. He turned, walked back toward his quarters, and prepared for the next task. What separates a man from a warrior is not skill with the sword. It is the code. As dusk settled across the valley and the light softened along the rooftops, Katsuro retreated to a shaded corner of the garden. Not to rest, but to reflect. This part of the estate was older, untouched by recent repairs. Moss crept along the stone path. Bamboo rustled overhead. The world grew quieter here, as if time itself paused to think. He knelt beside a koi pond and looked into the water, not to admire his reflection, but to observe the stillness. The fish glided beneath the surface, each movement precise, patient, unhurried. It reminded him of the sword, of life, of the way. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was not a law inscribed by government. It was not written on stone tablets or shouted from temple steps. It was passed silently from teacher to student, father to son, master to retainer. It was whispered in morning rituals and confirmed in how a man faced hardship. It was a code of conduct, yes, but more than that, it was a spiritual architecture. A structure that allowed chaos to be endured, war to be executed with dignity, and power to be wielded without corruption. Katsuro had been trained in its 8 core virtues since he could first hold a bamboo blade. But they were more than lessons, they were weights carried every moment of the day. Rectitude, GI, to act justly even when justice offers no reward. This was what led him to rule fairly in the hall. Not with favoritism, not with sentiment, but with a clean blade of thought. Right was not always easy, but it was always required. Courage, not the absence of fear, but mastery over it. He had felt fear before battle. Every true warrior had. But fear was not an obstacle, it was a threshold. One that had to be crossed, silently again and again. Benevolence, mercy without weakness. To wield power but choose compassion. Like when he spared the boy caught stealing. He could have punished him more harshly, but Bushido demanded that punishment serve harmony, not ego. Respect, to treat even the lowest peasant with the same dignity you give a lord. The bow, the silence, the manner in which he addressed those beneath him. It was not theater. It was belief. Honesty, Makoto, not merely truth-telling, but truth-being. To be aligned in word, thought, and action. A samurai who lied did more than disgrace himself, he cracked the armor of the entire clan. Honor, Meo, the unshakable reputation earned through a life of consistency. Katsuro's name was not his own. It was his family's, his clan's. When he walked into a room, he carried generations on his shoulders. Loyalty, Chugi, total allegiance to one's master, regardless of personal cost. If his lord ordered it, Katsuro would die without question. Not because he wished to, but because the code demanded it. Self-control, Jisei, the invisible armor. The discipline behind discipline. To restrain the blade. To withhold anger. To silence pride. Without this, all the other virtues collapsed. These were not abstract ideas. They were daily tasks. And failure in one was failure in all. Katsuro often wondered how many truly lived Bushido in full. He had known men who wore it like a mask, sharp in public, soft in secret. Others who used the code as a weapon, forcing lesser men to bow. But he had also known true practitioners. Men who carried themselves like monks of war, silent, resolved, sincere. His own father had been such a man. And when Katsuro had held his father's dying body in his arms, bloody, broken, eyes unblinking, he had not wept. He had bowed. Because to die in honor, with duty fulfilled and selfhood surrendered, was not tragedy. It was transcendence. A breeze passed through the garden now, rustling the leaves. A plum blossom drifted from a branch and landed on the surface of the pond. It floated without resistance. That too was Bushido. To fall at the right time. To make peace with gravity. Katsuro stood slowly, brushing off his hakama. The world around him was shifting again. The sun had dropped lower. Dinner would soon be served. More duties awaited. More decisions. He would move through them as he always did, not quickly, not emotionally, but aligned. To others, he was a warrior. But to himself, he was simply a man trying to walk the narrow road between chaos and purpose. And every step was guided by the code. Long after sunset, while others dined and relaxed in the common halls, Katsuro walked alone to the armory. He passed the sleeping garden and crossed a covered corridor that connected the main estate to the weapons hall. The building was windowless, cool inside, lined with rows of lacquered chests and wooden racks. It smelled of oiled leather, worn wood, iron dust, and ash. A sacred scent of readiness. This was no ordinary room. It was a vault of memory. A museum of duty. A temple of tools that had shaped the history of Japan through blood, balance, and belief. Katsuro stepped in and bowed, not to a person, but to the space itself. He moved first toward the sword rack. There, resting on a redwood stand, were his two blades, the katana and the wakizashi. Together, they formed the daisho shpig-little. Carried at the waist, they were never separated. They represented his rank, his soul, his right to kill, and his obligation not to. The katana was curved just over 2 feet in length. Forged years ago by a blacksmith in Kyoto, its edge was folded steel, polished to a mirror sheen. It wasn't just sharp. It was perfect. The balance, the weight, the harmonic alignment, all designed for one thing, the cleanest possible cut. He did not touch the blade. He simply studied it. The sword had taken lives. It had ended men with names and dreams. But Katsuro did not worship it for its lethality. He revered it for its restraint. He had drawn it only when nothing else would do. And even then he had felt its weight not in his hand but in his chest. The wakizashi, shorter and lighter, was used indoors or in tight quarters. It also served another, darker purpose, seppuku, a ritual suicide. A blade for honor through death. To be buried with your wakizashi was to say, even in the afterlife I remain accountable. Not far from the sword rack stood his armor. Not the ornate kind worn in court ceremonies, but his campaign set. The practical gear worn in war. It hung on a wooden frame, piece by piece. The kabuto, the helmet, forged with a flared neck guard and crested with the Matsunaga clan emblem, 3 folding fans in a triangle. The mempo, a fierce iron faceplate that covered his cheeks and nose. More than protection, it was a psychological weapon. The do, the breastplate, layered and lacquered, designed to deflect arrows and blades alike. The kote, armored sleeves with overlapping metal plates sewn into fabric. The sunniate and hide-ate shin and thigh guards, heavy but flexible, allowing for mobility in dense terrain. All of it was layered over a shitage, the inner kimono, and tied with cords that required careful binding. It could take up to half an hour to put on correctly. But a loose strap in battle was more than a nuisance. It was an invitation to die. Beside the armor stood a tall bow, his yumi, and a quiver of arrows. The yumi was taller than Katsuro himself, built asymmetrically with the grip below center. This shape allowed him to fire from horseback, from behind cover, or in kneeling position. Its range could exceed 300 feet in the hands of a skilled archer. Katsuro was more than skilled, he was lethal. He ran his hand gently along the bow's curve. He had used it in border skirmishes, in suppressing bandits, in tournaments before his lord. But never with cruelty. Each arrow he loosed carried not only death, but responsibility. Tools like these were never treated as objects. They were companions. Mirrors. They aged with their owner. They wore scars. They whispered stories. He remembered his first training sword, Simplewood, splintered over time. He remembered the first time he held a real katana and how heavy it felt. Not physically, spiritually. It had taken years before the sword felt like a part of him. And now, after decades of war and silence, it was an extension of his thoughts. He could strike before a man finished blinking. But that skill had not made him proud. It had made him quieter. Weapons, when truly mastered, do not make a man louder. They make him more deliberate. Katsuro knelt beside his armor stand and lit a small candle. Not for ritual. For memory. He sat in that hall for several minutes, surrounded by steel and silence, and thought about what it meant to wear these tools. Not just in battle, but in daily life. To wear the sword was to carry history. To wear armor was to carry expectation. To wield the bow was to say, I watch from a distance, but never forget the target. When he stood to leave, he bowed again. Then slid the door shut behind him. Outside, the moon had risen. And beneath its light, the warrior walked, not with noise, not with glory, but with the quiet of someone who knows that power, when earned, should weigh heavy in the hands. The samurai lived and died not for gold or glory, but for a name. That name belonged to the daimyo, the great lord to whom loyalty was pledged with blood. In Katsuro's case, that name was Matsunaga Takahiro, ruler of the Valley Province and master of the estate Katsuro protected. It was to Lord Matsunaga that Katsuro owed his food, his weapons, his land, and his very purpose. But loyalty in feudal Japan was never simple. It was not a feeling. It was not admiration. It was a contract. A silent agreement that one man would protect another's honor with his life and, if needed, erase his own name in doing so. Tonight, Katsuro stood in the upper corridor of the estate's formal hall, dressed in his most formal mantsuki, a black kimono bearing the clan crest. He waited outside a chamber where Lord Matsunaga was meeting with envoys from a neighboring province. The meeting concerned grain tariffs and the border trade route along the river. It was not Katsuro's place to speak. It was his place to be seen. The guards bowed as he passed. Pages stepped aside. When he entered the room, he bowed to the floor, then took his position standing near the wall, neither participant nor decoration, but presence. A reminder. Lord Matsunaga sat on a raised platform, robes layered, posture perfect. He spoke in calm, poised tones to the visiting nobles. He used no harsh words, no raised voice, but each phrase was sharpened like a blade. This was war by other means. Katsuro watched not only the content of the words, but the rhythm, the space between replies, the deference offered, the pauses chosen. This was where alliances were kept or broken, not on the battlefield, but on the tatami mat, between cups of tea and formal bows. Later, when the meeting concluded and the envoys departed, Lord Matsunaga turned to him. A quiet one tonight, he said. Katsuro bowed. The blade is quiet until drawn. The Lord smiled faintly. That's why I trust you. And that was it. The exchange ended. No orders. No formal rewards. Just trust. That was more dangerous and more valuable than any command. Because being trusted by a daimyo meant being seen as more than a tool. It meant you might be used in ways no other man would. A samurai in favor was a sword resting on silk. Beautiful. Silent. Deadly. But at any moment it could be unsheathed not against the enemy but against a friend. A retainer too powerful. A cousin too ambitious. A monk who spoke too freely. The samurai's loyalty was not to truth but to stability. And that truth had broken many men. Katsuro had seen it. He had been ordered to act against men he respected. To carry out judgments handed down not by law but by necessity. He had done it without hesitation. That was the meaning of Chugi loyalty. Not to justice, not to reason, but to the Lord. Because the samurai was not a knight. He was not a free agent or a hero with a personal code. He was a part of a system. One link in a chain that, when broken, could bring down an entire province. So he remained sharp. But not just his blade, his understanding of how power moved, how alliances shifted, how survival often depended on knowing when to stand still. And when to vanish. That night, as he returned to his quarters, he found a folded letter outside his door. No name, no seal, just a single phrase inside. Soon you will be asked to act. He burned it immediately. He did not need to know from whom it came. He understood what it meant. Power moved in silence. And loyalty, like a blade, cut both ways. The morning after the envoy meeting, Katsuro rose early once again. But today he did not remain within the estate. He left behind the polished wood floors and the trimmed gardens. He passed through the eastern gate with 2 retainers in tow, both armed but silent. Their presence was routine. It was not a patrol. It was a message. The samurai was watching. The village stretched in scattered clusters down the slope of the hill. Homes built of thatch and clay. Rice paddies tiered in terraces. Narrow dirt roads shaped more by foot traffic than by plan. Smoke curled gently from cooking fires. Chickens darted between straw piles. Children, half-dressed, paused to watch as Katsuro passed. They did not run to him. They did not cheer. They bowed. To them, the samurai was not a celebrity. He was a guardian and a reminder, a symbol of order that stood between them and the chaos of bandits, rival clans, famine, or rebellion. His presence was reassurance, but also judgment. The first stop was the granary, a simple structure with thick stone walls, guarded day and night. It held the collective grain stores for the estate. During lean seasons, its contents meant life or death. Katsuro met with the steward, inspected the inventory, reviewed harvest reports. There were no issues, but he asked the steward to report directly to the estate every third day. Quiet supervision was more effective than loud orders. From there, he moved to the communal well, then the blacksmith, then the sake brewer. At each stop, he asked questions, observed behavior, and listened carefully. Not just to words, but to tone, to body language, to silences. He was not looking for rebellion. He was looking for erosion. Small signs of dissatisfaction, greed, fear. These were the real threats to order. The samurai's role in the village was never just about defense. It was about presence. His armor didn't need to be worn. His sword didn't need to be drawn. It only needed to exist, visible enough to be remembered, distant enough to remain myth. Near the end of the main path, he stopped to speak with the village elder, a man named Hara. Stooped with age but sharp-eyed, Hara had advised 3 generations of samurai. His memory was better than the clan records. He greeted Katsuro with a deep bow and offered a seat beneath a plum tree. "The people are calm," he said, "but fear lingers from the rumors. Bandits along the northern road." Katsuro nodded. "Scouts have seen no movement. They won't until they strike." There was no panic in his tone, just wisdom. Life in the village was lived one harvest at a time, and the threat of violence never truly left. It simply moved farther or closer. "We'll increase patrols," Katsuro said. Hara bowed in thanks, but his eyes lingered. "You were in the hall yesterday," he said. Katsuro didn't answer. He didn't need to. Hara leaned closer. "Do you trust your master?" Katsuro looked down the dirt path, past the rice fields to the dark line of forest on the horizon. "My trust is not mine to give," he said quietly. "It was given for me." Hara nodded, unsurprised. "Then I pray your master is worth that trust." The conversation ended there. It had already gone further than it should have. But Katsuro did not feel anger. He respected truth, even when spoken from beneath a straw hat and bent shoulders. As he walked back through the village, a small child, no more than 4, ran toward him with a flower in hand. A mother gasped and pulled the child back, bowing frantically in apology. Katsuro stopped. He knelt slowly, took the flower, and set it gently into the band of his sash. He bowed to the child, then to the mother, that, more than his blade, would be remembered. When he returned to the estate that evening, he did not write a report. He did not issue punishments or corrections. He simply added 2 names to his mental ledger, one loyal, one watched. He made a note to send supplies to the blacksmith. He instructed that the brewer's son be considered for training as a page. Quiet gestures, invisible threads. A samurai's legacy was not only in who he killed. It was in what he preserved. Not every battle is fought in the open. Not every enemy wears armor. By the time night settled in, Katsuro's tasks as judge and enforcer had ended, but his duties as protector had not. Beneath the order of the village and the quiet halls of the estate, another layer of responsibility lived, one never discussed in court, never recorded in scrolls. It was the Shadow War. For years, bandit clans roamed the fringes of the province. Some were remnants of defeated armies. Others were criminals born in chaos, with no master but hunger. They moved through the forests and hills like ghosts, targeting shipments, tax collectors, and vulnerable villages. They stole food and blades, but more dangerously, they stole belief. Insecurity breeds discontent, and discontent spreads faster than blood. The samurai could not allow that. That night, Katsuro sat across from a man no one else on the estate acknowledged. He was not a warrior, not a retainer. He wore no crest. He had no title. To most, he was a charcoal merchant from the foothills. But to Katsuro, he was informant. They met under the outer corridor near the stables, where only the wind could overhear. The man brought a small bundle wrapped in rice paper, inside dried mushrooms. A symbol. The message was urgent. "They're gathering," the man whispered, "near the old well above the northern pass. 7, maybe 8 men, armed, not farmers." "Clan allegiance?" Katsuro asked. The man shook his head. "No colors, no names, just knives." Katsuro nodded and handed the man a pouch of rice and silver. No words of thanks were exchanged. The man vanished. By dawn, Katsuro had summoned 3 scouts. Not soldiers, riders. Silent men trained to move unseen, each carrying a short bow and a dagger. He gave them the coordinates. No noise, no warning. Watch and return. He would not engage yet. You do not strike an enemy you don't understand. Later that morning, a second report arrived. A missing courier. A merchant wagon intercepted on the road to the river. Cargo emptied. Driver left bound but alive. That was deliberate. A message. This was no random robbery. Katsuro moved to the map room. It was small and unadorned. Just a pine table, paper scrolls, weights, and ink stones. He studied the trade routes, the harvest supply lines, the likely paths of retreat. He marked where the river curved behind the hills, where riders might vanish, where bandits might blend into farmers if pursued. He didn't need to guess who they were. He only needed to know when they would move again. Banditry wasn't just theft. It was weakness, a test of the estate's stability. If they succeeded, more would follow. If they failed, and failed publicly, others would vanish like fog. But the samurai could not fight every battle. That was the secret of command. Strength was not in the blade. It was in the balance, knowing when to strike and when to wait. Katsuro also knew the political cost. The neighboring daimyo, Lord Suda, had recently suffered a raid in his western province. Whispers blamed negligence. Others blamed internal betrayal. If Katsuro's province suffered a similar blow, it would be seen not as misfortune, but as weakness in the Matsunaga clan. And weakness invited ambition. As the sun lowered again, Katsuro penned a letter to the head scout. Observe, count, watch for symbols, armament, and formation. If they bear no clan, they are lawless. If they bear one, we must know which. He sealed the scroll and pressed his ring into the wax. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added one more sentence. If one can be captured alive, do so. He did not write why. He didn't need to. There was always someone behind the movement of knives. The bandits might be desperate, but someone had taught them how to time ambushes, how to leave survivors, how to operate just close enough to the border to create doubt, yet not close enough to warrant open retaliation. It wasn't war. It was pressure. A test. As Katsuro extinguished the candle in the map room, he tightened his jaw. He could deal with blood. He could face swords. But what truly threatened peace was erosion. One whisper at a time. One missing wagon. One family turning away from trust. Travel was never casual for a samurai. Every journey was a calculated risk, a balance of exposure, distance, duty, and diplomacy. The roads of feudal Japan were more than dirt and stone. They were veins of power. Whoever controlled the roads controlled the realm. And Katsuro was about to ride them again. A letter had arrived from the provincial seat 3 days prior. A formal summons. Lord Matsunaga was to send a representative to the upcoming council of neighboring daimyo. It was a minor summit on the surface, a chance to discuss taxes, regional disputes, and water rights. But beneath the ritual was the unspoken reason all such councils mattered: posturing. The balance of power between clans was never static. Each meeting, each absence, each phrasing of each phrase was measured like a blade at your throat. Katsuro had attended 2 such councils before. He hated them, But he never refused. Before departure, he prepared carefully. He selected a small escort, 6 riders, 1 servant, 2 scribes. Not a military procession, but enough to show presence. He wore formal robes marked with the Matsunaga crest, his armor packed in the supply cart ready to don at the first sign of trouble. His katana remained on his hip as always. They departed at dawn. The first day's ride took them through bamboo groves and low valleys. The roads were quiet but not empty. Peasants moved with carts, carrying charcoal and rice. Merchants traveled in guarded clusters. Occasionally, they passed monks or pilgrims identifiable by their staffs and straw hats. At each village, Katsuro was received with deference but not fanfare. He was known, and known figures needed no announcement. What most travelers did not see were the details Katsuro tracked constantly: signs of sabotage in the road, strange burn marks at a rest station, a thatched roof recently repaired after fire. To others, they were nothing. To him, they were clues. They stopped briefly at a government Sekisho, a checkpoint fortress stationed at a river crossing. Here, papers were reviewed, seals verified, and the names of all riders recorded. Even samurai were not exempt. It was a reminder no man traveled without consequence. At nightfall, they reached an inn maintained by one of the neutral clans. It was simple but secure. Katsuro chose to eat in his room: miso soup, rice, pickled daikon, and green tea. The servant assigned to him was discreet. Young but trained. Katsuro asked only one question: have other envoys passed this way? Yes, master. A retinue bearing the crest of Lord Suda crossed yesterday. Suda again. Katsuro stored the details silently. He knew the clan's ambitions stretched wider than their resources allowed. The fact that Suda's envoy had passed so early meant something, perhaps eagerness, perhaps fear. Both were dangerous. The next morning, his group resumed the journey. The land flattened into open plain where threats changed shape. Here, mounted bandits could strike. Arrows could come from anywhere. The scouts fanned out naturally, riders flanking wide. No one spoke of danger. They simply prepared for it. At one point, the road forked. One path led through a narrow valley, shorter but enclosed. The other curved along the foothills, longer but open. Katsuro chose the longer path, not because he feared ambush, but because he respected it. Later that day, they passed a village recovering from a flood. Fields still soaked. Children barefoot in the mud. One of the scribes wanted to stop and offer aid. Katsuro allowed it, but only briefly. Every moment lost was a moment taken by someone else. By the third day, they approached the outskirts of the council's host estate. The banners flew high, each bearing the crests of attending lords. Horses were being stabled. Tents erected. Guards posted. Diplomats in colorful robes walked in tight formations, whispering rehearsed greetings. Everything smelled of incense, sweat, and expectation. Katsuro dismounted and adjusted his robes. He was not here to speak much, but he was here to be seen. In the world of lords and power, the sword was rarely drawn, but it was never forgotten. Warriors were not expected to love beauty, but they were expected to understand it. Katsuro sat in the tea house, spine straight, hands folded over his knees, eyes lowered, not in submission but in presence. The room was small, just wide enough to seat 4. Tatami mats lined the floor. The scent of tatami, hot water, and pine filled the air. The host moved like water, quiet, precise, never rushed. Every gesture was deliberate, each cloth folded with purpose. The tea ladle dipped into the kettle with a whisper, then poured into the bowl with the sound of calm rain. This was not hospitality. It was ceremony. Shinoya, the way of tea. It had been introduced from China centuries earlier, but by Katsuro's time it had become deeply woven into the warrior class. Lords hosted tea as a sign of refinement. Retainers participated as a demonstration of humility and focus. And for the samurai, it offered something few other rituals allowed: silence without suspicion. The walls of the tea house were blank. The only decoration was a hanging scroll with a single brush-painted character, mu, nothing. Katsuro had meditated on that word many times. It meant emptiness. Not absence, but space. The space between thoughts, between actions, between violence and peace. In the tea room, mu was the only armor permitted. The host, a middle-aged retainer named Genda, presented the bowl. Katsuro accepted it with both hands, raised it to eye level in respect, and turned it clockwise. Then slowly he drank. 3 sips. No more. No less. Each held on the tongue like a vow. The tea was bitter. Intentionally so. The bitterness was not something to avoid. It was to be accepted. Welcomed. Just like failure. Just like pain. When he returned the bowl, he bowed. The host bowed in return. No words had yet been spoken. None needed to be. The next guest to drink was a diplomat from the Suda clan. Younger. Polished. Too quick in movement. He nodded, smiled politely, but his knees shifted often, his fingers restless. He bowed without waiting for the host to finish his own bow. Small breaches. But they said everything. Katsuro watched him with the same attention he gave a sparring opponent. Posture. Timing. Composure. The tea room was not a duel, but it was not without confrontation. Here, no blade could defend you. Only your presence. After the second round, a light sweet was passed. A small rice cake with red bean. The contrast was intentional, bitter followed by sweet. A reminder, balance was not found in force, but in harmony. Finally, Genda spoke. Only one sentence. Thank you for bringing stillness. Katsuro bowed again. Thank you for offering it. And that was all. The ceremony ended with the cleaning of the utensils. Even this was deliberate. The bamboo whisk. The cloths. The scoop. Each returned to its place with care. The sound of folding fabric and water dripping from the ladle was music. Not to entertain. To center. When they exited the tea house, the world seemed louder. Birds chirped. Footsteps returned. Distant conversations drifted on the breeze. But Katsuro's mind remained anchored. The tea ceremony was not about tea. It was about intention. You could not rush. You could not pretend. You had to be there or the moment collapsed. That's why it was a warrior's art. Because presence is the highest form of readiness. And stillness, the hardest kind of strength. Katsuro had never asked to marry. That decision, like so many others in his life, had been made for him. It was not an insult. It was a mechanism. A quiet agreement between lords. A binding of names, of bloodlines, of political futures. The letter had come weeks ago. Brief. Final. A formal notice from Lord Matsunaga the marriage would take place at the end of the harvest. His bride, Lady Akiko, was the daughter of a high-ranking ally. He had seen her once, years ago, at a seasonal festival, distant, veiled, surrounded by attendants. They had not spoken. He did not know her voice. He did not know her laughter. But he would come to know her footsteps. A samurai's life rarely allowed for choice. But when it came to family, that absence of choice felt sharper. More personal. The sword was a duty. Marriage, too, but one far more permanent. One far less spoken of in training halls or war councils. The samurai wife was not idle. She ran the household, managed servants, oversaw domestic stores, handled ceremonial duties, and in times of danger, could even take up arms. Some were trained in naginata, the curved blade used by women of rank. Others wrote poetry, advised on politics, kept family ledgers. A good wife was not a reward. She was a partner in stability. Katsuro knew this in theory. But theory did not prepare a man for the quiet echo of someone else's presence in his space. She would soon sleep on the other side of his chamber. Fold robes beside his. Tend to the incense before he rose. Perhaps she would speak little. Perhaps she would challenge him. Perhaps, though he doubted it, she would understand the silence he carried like a second blade. As he sat beneath the cypress tree behind the main hall, Katsuro looked at the path leading from the estate's southern gate. That was where she would arrive. With attendants. With gifts. With the smell of new fabric and perfumed hair. He would bow. She would bow. They would become husband and wife with the same practiced formality as two swords passing at a ceremony. He wondered if she resented it. Perhaps she had loved someone else. A childhood friend. A poet. A merchant's son. Perhaps she had dreamed of a different life. But dreams were not consulted in matters of alliance. They were stored quietly like unsent letters in the back of a drawer. He thought of his own mother. She had rarely spoken of her youth. But when she died, he found a box of poems written in a delicate hand never shared. One had read, "I traded a field of plum blossoms for a name I could not choose. Now I bloom in silence, hoping the wind remembers me." Katsuro had memorized the lines. Burned the paper. That too was Bushido. Marriage was not a betrayal of the code. But it was a test of it. It required loyalty without battle. Courage without violence. Honor in moments no one would ever witness. There were nights he wondered what kind of man he might have been had he chosen freely. But that thought never lingered long. Regret was a luxury, one that the samurai could not afford. Still, he prepared. He had the western room cleaned and repainted. He requested a second incense tray. He wrote a formal welcome letter to Lady Akiko by hand, elegant, brief, correct. He did not speak of feelings. He did not mention the cherry tree that bloomed beside his window in spring. But he did close the letter with a single line that was not expected. "Whatever silence you carry, it will not frighten me." He signed it, folded it, sealed it, and waited. A samurai's life is never his alone. From birth, he is owned not by chains, not by law, but by legacy. Katsuro understood this more with each passing year. He felt it in the way elders looked at him, not with warmth, but with expectation. He felt it in how the younger retainers paused when he spoke, waiting for permission to breathe. He felt it most of all when he stood before the ancestral tablets where the names of the dead lived on in ink and incense. His own name would join them someday. It would be written with the same brush that had recorded his father's death and his grandfather's before him. No song, no monument, just a plank of polished wood. One name among many. That was the legacy he served. It was not about renown, not about being remembered. It was about continuity, about protecting the shape of the clan through time. A name did not need to be praised, it needed to be preserved. The Matsunaga family had ruled this province for 3 generations. Their crest, the 3 folding fans, appeared on every banner, document, and seal across the region. Katsuro's own family had served them for nearly as long. If Matsunaga Takahiro fell, so would they. The clan's success was their oxygen. Their failure, suffocation. That's why legacy mattered more than preference. And it's why his upcoming marriage was only the beginning. The clan needed heirs. Not just bloodlines, but trained bloodlines. Children raised not in comfort, but in structure. Boys who could lead. Girls who could form alliances through marriage or serve as advisors, poets, even warriors. The future was not shaped by birth alone, it was shaped by upbringing. Katsuro was not a man driven by fatherhood, but he was a man driven by responsibility. He had already begun laying the groundwork. The estate's family ledger was updated monthly. He reviewed it personally. He ensured the right tutors were in place for the current lord's children. He inspected the weapon stock stored for future generations. Even the scrolls in the study chamber were organized by theme, date, and difficulty so a child years from now could find the right path. That too was swordsmanship, just slower. He had also begun selecting names. For sons, for daughters. Not out loud, just in his mind. He thought of names that echoed meaning. Rei respect, Hajime beginning, Takashi warrior, Kaoru fragrance used for both genders, Aiko beloved child. Would they live in a time of war? Or peace? Would they bear swords? Or pens? Would they question the life they were given? Or walk it in silence? He did not know. But he knew it was his duty to make the path clean. He remembered when he was 7, watching his father speak to the local magistrate. Katsuro had not understood the topic, but he had never forgotten the silence that followed. It was powerful. Absolute. His father had worn no armor, drawn no sword. But in that silence, he had held the entire room in his hand. That was legacy. Not in blood spilled, but in composure passed down like a blade that never rusted. Some days, Katsuro wondered what the world would become. Gunpowder was spreading. Foreigners were arriving on coastal ships. Words like merchant class and district council appeared more often in reports. The old world, the one ruled by iron and paper seals, was changing. But as long as he lived, he would serve the name above his own. He would shape a legacy not through conquest, but through cultivation. Because the true duty of the samurai is not to die with honor. It is to live in a way that makes the next generation stronger. Every morning, Katsuro bowed before the dead. He did not ask them for protection. He did not beg for favor. He simply acknowledged their presence, their watchfulness, their patience. The altar in his room was small, a single wooden shelf elevated slightly above eye level. On it stood 4 memorial tablets, each bearing the name of a man who had carried a sword before him: father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-uncle. Their names were inked in brush strokes, black on black, only visible in the right light. Below the tablets, offerings. A bowl of rice. A few pickled plums. Sometimes sake. Always incense. The smoke rose like memory. To Katsuro, this act was not symbolic. It was structural. As real as armor. As necessary as training. It reminded him that he was not the first and would not be the last. Samurai did not speak of religion often. It was not argued over, dissected, or preached. It was lived, carried, integrated. The boundary between sacred and mundane was thinner in his world. He walked beneath gods without needing to see them. The kami spirits of nature, objects, ancestors were everywhere. In the forest that fed the village. In the stone well beside the stables. In the sword that had outlived 3 owners. To honor the kami was not superstition. It was alignment. Misfortune wasn't always punishment. Sometimes it was imbalance. Forgetting. Disrespect. A lack of offering. A broken promise made quietly to the wind. At certain times of year, especially during Oban, the festival of the dead, Katsuro would visit the temple at the edge of the estate. A small Shinto structure tucked between pine trees, its torii gate half covered in moss. There he would wash his hands with mountain water, ring the shrine bell, and bow twice. Then silently he would stand, not to pray, not to confess, but to remember. He remembered his father's last breath. The way he had gripped Katsuro's sleeve, and not with desperation, but with purpose. Hold the line, he'd said. Not a military line. A spiritual one. The line between chaos and peace. Between impulse and discipline. It was at that moment Katsuro understood the purpose of ancestor veneration. It was not for comfort. It was for continuity. Each man who died did not disappear. He became part of the foundation beneath the living. To break the connection was to fall into meaninglessness. To honor it was to remain steady even when the world tilted. Buddhism, too, shaped his thinking. He had read from sutras in his youth, studied the Four Noble Truths, practiced seated meditation alongside monks in cold stone halls where speech was forbidden. The lesson that had remained most clearly was impermanence. Everything fades. Beauty, strength, memory, even legacy. So you act not to preserve yourself, but to preserve the pattern. His view of death was shaped by this. He did not fear it. He did not welcome it. He simply prepared for it. He kept a scroll in his room titled Kyogaku no Sho, the Mirror of Teaching. It was a Zen text handwritten by a former sword master turned monk. One line haunted him. The man who holds the sword must also carry his own coffin on his back. Not for drama. For readiness. Samurai were often thought to be creatures of war. But in truth, they were creatures of death awareness. They lived more vividly because they understood their edge. And that edge was not always physical. Sometimes it was spiritual. That night, as rain pattered softly on the roof, Katsuro lit another stick of incense. He knelt before the altar, eyes closed, spine straight. He thought of the ones who came before him. He thought of the ones who would come after. And he whispered nothing, because silence, when offered to the dead, is louder than any prayer. He had never seen a ninja's face, but he had seen their work. The rumors always arrived first, like wind before a storm. A murdered official. A message intercepted. A gate unlocked from within. No blood. No witnesses. Just outcomes. Katsuro had learned early not to believe the stories whispered among soldiers, that ninja flew across rooftops like spirits, killed without touching the ground, vanished into clouds of smoke. Those were stories for farmers and children. The truth was less magical and far more dangerous. The ninja were not phantoms. They were men. Trained. Quiet. Strategic. They did not fight for honor. They fought for effect. In his early years as a retainer, Katsuro had helped guard a high-value convoy transporting gold to a coastal lord. The path was remote, the escort strong. On the third night, one man in the rear camp vanished. No sound. No struggle. His armor was found neatly folded by the river. His sword untouched. The man had not run. He had been removed. That was the first time Katsuro understood the ninja were not soldiers. They were shadows shaped into tools. Their loyalty wasn't to a code, but to contracts. And that made them difficult to predict because it made them flexible. To a samurai, that flexibility bordered on dishonor. The Bushido code forbade deception. A samurai announced himself before a duel. He wore his crest into battle. He fought face to face. The sword was truth, and truth was the foundation of order. The ninja threatened that order. They struck at night, used disguises, poison, disinformation. They were not cowards, but they were outside the structure. Outside the rituals that defined life and death in Katsuro's world. Still, he did not hate them. He respected them for their discipline, for their silence, for their willingness to move in spaces the samurai could not. Some clans employed them in secret. Even the Matsunaga had during the border war of 1573. Katsuro hadn't known at the time. He found out only years later when a prisoner confessed that the enemy had known the convoy's route in advance. Not by magic, but by payment. Even as Katsuro sharpened his sword, others worked behind his back in ink and shadows. It had bothered him once. Now it only clarified his role. The samurai held the wall. The ninja tested the cracks. They were not opposites. They were part of the same system. And yet, samurai were remembered as heroes. Ninja as ghosts. Perhaps that was fair. One walked in light, the other in consequence. Once, in the deep of winter, a message had arrived at the estate sealed in plain wax. No signature. Inside, only one sentence. The assassin was removed. You need not look further. Katsuro had burned the paper, not in anger, in understanding. Some victories were not celebrated. Some enemies were dealt with by allies who would never attend the tea ceremony, never kneel at the shrine, never be written into the clan scrolls. But without them, the scrolls might never be written at all. Katsuro did not speak of ninja to the younger retainers. He did not romanticize them. He did not demonize them. He simply left them in the place they belonged. Unseen, but not unknown. The dojo was colder in the early hours, silent, dew-lined, waiting. Before the students arrived, Katsuro stood alone on the polished wooden floor, barefoot, centered. The weight of his bakken, a wooden practice sword, rested in his hands. He struck a clean horizontal cut, then another, then a third. Each motion was slow, precise, practiced. Not for combat, for demonstration. He heard the footsteps before he saw them, rows of sandals lining the outer platform, bodies kneeling, heads bowed. 12 young men, ages 12 to 18. Ashigaru's sons, minor retainers, pages of local officials, all sent to train under the household's martial instructors. Katsuro wasn't their official sensei, but today he would lead the morning session. Not because it was scheduled, but because it was necessary. The students rose as one. No salutes, no introductions, just silent acknowledgement. Katsuro raised his bakken. They followed. The first hour was Kihan fundamentals. Stances, footwork, the grip that determined whether the blade followed the mind or betrayed it. Some students were stiff, others too fluid, but none were ready. He corrected them with touch, not words. A shift of the shoulder, a nudge of the elbow, a quiet glance. He did not need to shout. The air itself demanded attention. Again, he said once. They obeyed. The second hour was pairing drills. Strike, block, counter, the rhythm of controlled aggression. Katsuro walked among them like a shadow, watching how they moved under pressure. He stopped beside one boy, 15, confident, careless. His strike was fast but wide. Katsuro stepped behind him and spoke quietly. Speed without focus is noise. The boy nodded. His next cut was slower, sharper. They moved on to sparring. Katsuro selected 3 students to face him in turn. Not to test them, to teach through loss. Each came forward with a bow. Each struck with effort. Each was disarmed in under 10 seconds. He returned their swords gently. You were not learning to win, he said. You were learning not to die. That lesson echoed. By the end of the third hour, sweat dripped from brows, feet trembled from stance, shoulders burned from repetition. But no one complained. The pain was part of the forging. They ended as they had begun, with silence. Katsuro faced them at the front of the dojo. He looked at each one, not for technique, but for posture, for breath, for intent. They were not soldiers yet. But some would be. Others would govern, advise, marry into stronger families. Each in their own way would hold a piece of the estate's stability. He did not tell them to be strong. He told them to be ready. Your sword, he said, is not the blade in your hand. It is the choice before you draw it. Then he bowed. They bowed lower. After the students left, Katsuro remained. He returned his bakken to the rack, walked the length of the dojo, and paused near the scroll hanging at the far wall. Shizai. Sincerity. It had been written decades ago by his first instructor, now long dead. The ink had faded, but the line remained. He remembered being 12 himself, trembling before that same scroll, not yet strong enough to hold a katana with 2 hands. He had tried to imitate his sensei's every movement, only to be corrected again and again. But the moment that had stayed with him was not a strike. It was a mistake. He had spoken out of turn. His instructor had not raised a hand. Only said, a sword that speaks too much dulls itself. That sentence had stayed with him longer than any cut. Now he was the one being watched. Not for elegance, but for consistency. Every movement, every command, every pause was a lesson. The students would not remember every technique, but they would remember how he stood, how he breathed, how he carried silence, and that would shape the way they carried their own swords. War rarely announced itself. It arrived like winter, slow at first, then all at once. The scouts had returned. Their reports confirmed Katsuro's suspicions. A group of 30 armed men camped near the foothills. Not farmers, not vagrants, coordinated, waiting. They wore no crest, but their formation spoke of discipline. Not mercenaries, possibly retainers in disguise. They hadn't moved yet, but they would. Katsuro sat at his desk in the administrative hall, a map unrolled before him. His eyes scanned the landscape. Supply routes, water lines, hill passes, ambush points. He didn't need to know their intent. He only needed to deny them opportunity. This was the beginning of readiness. Phase 1, Logistics. He summoned the quartermaster and issued orders with clarity. Count the armor, every cuirass, greave, and helmet. Inspect the bowstrings. Replace the worn. Confirm the oil for torches, the sacks of rice, the condition of the water barrels. Rotate the horses. No mount should carry more than half its strength 2 days in a row. A samurai could not fight with empty stomachs behind him. Phase 2, the men. The Ishigaru foot soldiers were summoned to drill. 50 in total, armed with spears and bows. They were not elite, but they were trained, and they trusted Katsuro. He stood in the courtyard as they formed ranks. His armor glinted in the sunlight. Not ceremonial, but functional. Leather plates bound over cloth. No gold, no silk. He addressed them without theatrics. There is no battle today. That does not matter. Readiness is not for when war begins. It is what keeps it from beginning. Then, sparring formations, archery exercises, siege simulations using bamboo frames. He walked among them, correcting stances, tightening grips, measuring fear. Some joked, others sweated. All obeyed, not because of command, because of confidence. Phase 3, Communication. Messengers were dispatched to neighboring allies. Couriers on horseback, traveling at night, carrying sealed letters bearing the Matsunaga crest. Not to beg for aid, but to show vigilance. An unspoken message. We see. We are ready. Do not test us. Katsuro also sent word to the village elder, Hara. The rice stores would be guarded. The granary reinforced. No curfew yet, but civilians were advised to report strangers and avoid forest paths. Panic was poison. Quiet alertness saved more lives than sharp steel. Phase 4, the silent war. The informant returned. Katsuro met him behind the smithy. They're waiting for a signal, the man said. No one's spoken it aloud, but that's what they do. They wait. Who leads them? No name, but he doesn't speak like a bandit. Katsuro nodded. That meant one thing, a hired hand. An outside strategist. Someone paid to destabilize. Perhaps Suda. Perhaps another rival. Perhaps even a Matsunaga defector. It didn't matter. The enemy could sharpen their knives in the dark. Katsuro would sharpen his silence. That night he walked the perimeter. Torches flickered. Guards stood at their posts. Rain had started, a light drizzle. It soaked the ground, cooled the nerves. The sword at his waist felt heavier in the damp. Not from water, from consequence. He checked each station. Not for appearances, for readiness. He looked into the eyes of every man. The older ones looked back with steady resolve. The younger ones, some with fear. He didn't scold them. He simply said, "Fear does not dishonor you. Failing your post does." Then moved on. He returned to his quarters after midnight, removed his armor piece by piece, dried his blade, folded his robe, sat cross-legged before the altar, lit a single stick of incense, and whispered, "Let this be a test of structure, not blood." The smoke rose. Outside, the hills were silent, but not still. Katsuro had seen 3 men take their own lives, not in despair, not in cowardice, in order. The first was his uncle, at the age of 35, accused of failing in a key negotiation that cost the clan influence. The second, a general captured in battle who chose death over ransom. The third, a retainer who broke his oath, not through betrayal, but by killing a man without permission. All 3 had performed seppuku. All 3 had died with grace, but not peace. The practice was older than Katsuro himself. Originally used as a battlefield ritual, seppuku became a formalized rite, codified, performed, respected. A man who took his own life in this way was not seen as defeated. He was seen as reclaiming his honor with the only thing he still controlled, his death. It was not a punishment. It was an answer. Katsuro remembered every detail of his uncle's death. The quiet hall, the white mats, the ceremonial robe, the short blade tanto laid on a black lacquer tray. The second, or kaishikunin, was his father. His uncle knelt, wrote a final poem, and spoke no apology. Then, with both hands, he drew the blade across his stomach, from left to right. His face remained calm, but his body shook. His father stepped forward and ended the ritual with one clean stroke to the neck. Honorable, controlled, quick. It was not execution. It was closure. The next day, his uncle's name was added to the family records, not as a failure, but as one who met death with discipline. No shame followed, only silence and respect. Even as a boy, Katsuro had understood the message. A samurai's worth was not just measured in how he lived. It was measured in how he accepted the consequences of failure. Still, he wondered, did honor demand death, or did the system demand it to preserve its own shape? Seppuku was not offered to farmers, nor to merchants, only to those of rank. It was, in a brutal way, a privilege, a final act of self-governance. But it was also control, used by lords to end scandals, tie up loose ends, silence disobedience with elegance. Katsuro had never been ordered to perform it. He had never had to witness it again. But he kept a tanto in a silk-wrapped case in the back of his drawer, not as a threat, as a tool. If the day ever came where failure could not be repaired, where his actions brought ruin upon the clan or disgrace upon the name, he knew what would be expected, and he would not resist it, because seppuku was not about choice. It was about responsibility. The scrolls spoke of it in poetic language. To bloom like a final flower in red, then return to the soil. But Katsuro knew better. It was pain. It was blood. It was an act of will so absolute, it frightened even the brave. He feared it, not the act itself, but the moment that might justify it. Still, he believed in the ritual's meaning. It reminded the samurai that every action bore weight, that every decision could lead to a final accounting. It sharpened judgment more than any threat from an enemy, because sometimes the deadliest judge was one's own reflection. And seppuku was the final sentence handed down by that court. As he watched the horizon darken that evening, smoke curling from the village chimneys, Katsuro rested his hand on the hilt of his sword. The real one, the one meant for others, not himself. But he knew the other blade remained nearby, unspoken, unseen, waiting not in shadow, but in honor. Katsuro's hands had broken bone. They had cut flesh, gripped steel, pushed back against death. But they also wrote poems. Not often, not for praise, but in the hours between dusk and obligation, when silence stretched long and the world softened just enough for memory to whisper. His poetry was brief, often no more than 5 lines. He never signed them, never recited them aloud. He simply placed them in a wooden box beside his inkstone where only time would read them. This was not uncommon. Among the samurai, art was not a contradiction. It was a necessity. The harder the life, the more one required shape, form, and discipline in beauty. Just as the blade demanded control, so did the brush. In fact, the two are not so different. The practice of shodo calligraphy was a daily ritual in many samurai homes. It was not about language. It was about form, posture, breath. Ink must flow like intention. Every stroke mattered. Too fast and the meaning dissolved. Too hesitant and the spirit vanished. Katsuro had learned this at 15 under the stern guidance of a half-blind calligrapher who could no longer fight, but whose brushwork cut deeper than any sword. He remembered one lesson clearly. Your enemy can see your sword, the old man said, but only your soul sees your lines. There was truth in that. In times of peace, samurai composed poetry known as waka or haiku, short verses meant to capture fleeting thoughts. Not to entertain, but to crystallize the impermanent. Rain, blossoms, shadows, death. Katsuro's poems often touched on the intersection of steel and stillness. Cold blade in spring air. Cherry petals drift downward. I choose not to strike. He did not write to be heard. He wrote to hold together the inner walls of his own mind. The estate maintained a small art room, simple, clean, with scrolls lining the wall and brushes hung like tools of faith. Occasionally, other retainers gathered there, sharing verses, offering respectful nods of approval. No laughter. No applause. Poetry was not performance. It was discipline made soft. He also admired sumie ink painting. Just black ink. No color. No embellishment. Mountains with a single brushstroke. Trees that seemed to breathe. The restraint was what gave it strength. Just like swordsmanship, it was about omission. The right stroke. In the right place. At the right time. One misplaced line and the image collapsed. Katsuro had painted once. Only once. A pine tree bent by wind. He hadn't liked it, but he hadn't thrown it away. It still hung in his chamber, unframed, half-faded, above the armor rack. A reminder not of failure, but of effort. Beauty wasn't the absence of violence. It was the ability to remain balanced in its presence. Some nights, Katsuro would walk the estate alone, listening to the sound of frogs or the wind shifting through bamboo. He would pause by the koi pond, watch the ripples, note the way the moon broke on the water's surface. And from that image, a line would come. Beneath armor, skin. Beneath skin, thought. Beneath thought, stillness. He'd return to his quarters and write it down. No one needed to read it. The act itself was enough. For a samurai, poetry was not escape. It was survival. Katsuro did not dread death. He studied it, not as philosophy, not as threat, but as architecture. Every day he lived was framed by it. Every decision carried its shadow. And because of that, he lived sharply. Death gave clarity. He first understood this when he was 9. A retainer he admired, Yukimasa, was killed in a skirmish defending a rice transport. The man had trained Katsuro in spear drills. He had once lifted him onto his horse, laughing. His death was sudden. No farewell. No ceremony. Katsuro had cried. His father did not forbid the tears, but he explained them. You weep, he said, because you had not yet made peace with his death. That sentence had haunted him. Peace with death. As if it were not just a possible future, but a necessary one. Inevitable. Intimate. In time, Katsuro learned to be a samurai meant to carry your death with you. Everywhere. He read the Hagakure, a guide for warriors, dozens of times. Its most famous line was etched into his memory. The way of the samurai is found in death. Not in killing. In being ready to die. That readiness didn't breed recklessness. It bred focus. If death was no longer to be feared, then hesitation lost its power. You could act, not because you didn't care about life, but because you had already accepted its end. The samurai's discipline wasn't rooted in domination. It was rooted in detachment, not coldness. Clarity. Death was not tragedy. It was punctuation. What mattered was the sentence that came before it. Katsuro believed in what some monks called the good death. Not just bravery in the moment, but a life lived so cleanly that death could be faced without flinching. That meant no corruption. No indulgence. No apology. To die poorly was to shame your ancestors. To die well was to honor your name. And yet he did not long for it. He valued life. The taste of rice after a long ride. The sound of the stream behind the shrine. The weight of the sword in his hand humming with memory. He wanted to live. Not forever, but fully. And to live fully, one had to practice dying. He visualized it often. Where would it happen? On the battlefield? In the courtyard? In bed with his children grown? Would it come suddenly? Or after slow decline? Would he be remembered? He did not need an answer. The act of asking was enough. That detachment bled into every part of his conduct. He did not hoard wealth. He kept no ornate possessions. He wore no perfume. His chambers were spare, functional, clean. His letters were brief. His gestures measured. He planned for departure every day, even while building for the future. Because to him, the two were not at odds. Building and leaving. Living and dying. Both were parts of service. He had already prepared his death poem. It was folded in a black cloth and hidden in a drawer no one opened. He had revised it many times, but never changed its last line. I held the blade, but never became it. When he read that line, he felt no fear. Only stillness. Because the greatest strength a samurai could wield was not power. It was readiness. And death, when accepted, was no longer a threat. It was simply a door. The province was quiet. But quiet did not mean safe. Katsuro had learned that peace was never permanent. It was a pause between storms. A mask worn over ambition. Behind every polite bow, every ceremonial gift, every offer of shared grain or marriage alliance, something sharper always waited. The scroll from Lord Suda arrived in the morning. Elegant handwriting. Formal phrasing. It spoke of mutual interest, of shared prosperity, of future opportunity. It said nothing directly, but Katsuro read between every line. Suda's recent movements near the border, the increased presence of his scouts, the sudden marriages of his cousins into neighboring families, this letter was not a peace offering. It was a signal, a test, a declaration without a sword. Katsuro didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the upper terrace of the estate where the full layout of the valley could be seen. The rice fields, the roads, the trade routes, all peaceful now but all exposed. He called a meeting of the inner retainers that afternoon. 5 men, all seasoned, all quiet thinkers. They reviewed maps, supply ledgers, marriage records, intelligence reports. Not one mentioned war, not one spoke of blood, but every word was sharpened by the knowledge that the wrong alliance or the wrong delay could collapse years of order. Katsuro voiced his analysis plainly. If we appear too eager, we look weak. If we ignore the message, we look blind. If we respond aggressively, we give them reason. One retainer suggested inviting Suda's envoy to a harvest ceremony. Another recommended sending a gift, dried persimmons and sake, wrapped in gold paper. A gesture of respect without submission. A third questioned if Matsunaga would approve any correspondence at all. That was the core tension. A samurai was not free to act as he wished. He was an extension of the Lord's will. But sometimes delay itself was disloyalty. Sometimes waiting for the perfect order meant letting the wrong outcome take root. Katsuro weighed every option. He had been in this position before. During a previous conflict, a single miscue had resulted in 2 years of stalled negotiations and a near uprising by a minor clan. It had taken months to untangle. Dozens of letters. 3 arranged marriages. And, in the end, the death of a neutral envoy no one had wanted to claim responsibility for. Peace was not easy. It was maintenance. Like cleaning a blade. Like managing fire. Too much control and it chokes. Too little and it spreads. That evening, Katsuro drafted a reply. It was short, careful, respectful. Your words of goodwill are received with sincerity. May the mountains continue to divide only wind. Let the grain flow and the names remain steady. He sealed the scroll with black wax and handed it to a trusted writer. No promise. No refusal. Only posture. He knew Suda would see it for what it was, neither acceptance nor rejection. A shield held high, but not yet drawn. As the rider disappeared into the misted hills, Katsuro returned to the study and opened the clan records. He reviewed past alliances, past betrayals, past collapses that began with a single friendly letter. Then he lit incense and wrote in his private journal, "In war, we fear the sword. In peace, we fear the smile." Because the truth was simple. War could be won with strategy. Peace could only be survived with vigilance. It did not happen in a single year. There was no announcement, no decree, no clang of temple bells to mark the fall. Came as a soft erosion, like rain against stone. Katsuro first felt it in the letters written not on silk, but cheap paper, less formal, more rushed. He felt it in the arrival of merchant caravans with foreign coins, strange tools, silk dyed in colors no Japanese loom could create. He saw it in the young retainers, more curious about rifles than swords, more interested in trade than poetry. Fewer quoted the Hagakure, more asked about market routes, silver flow, and village population sizes. He did not blame them. He blamed time. The Tokugawa peace had lasted longer than any before it. With peace came structure. With structure, bureaucracy. With bureaucracy, merchants. Wealth replaced valor. Paper replaced steel. The samurai remained, but their place became harder to name. Katsuro's duties now included audits, crop projections, local tax disputes. He still trained, still walked the perimeter, but fewer threats arrived with banners. More came through ledgers, laws, quiet edicts from Edo that restructured domains and reclassified ranks. Even the daimyo, once near-sovereign warlords, now submitted to the shogunate with ritualized trips to the capital and scripted declarations of loyalty. Power had become theater. The sword was no longer a promise. It was a costume. Katsuro felt the change most deeply in the silence of the armor room. Once every week he had inspected each set, polished each plate, ensured that the leather cords were tight, the helmets smooth, the greaves clean. Now weeks passed between inspections. Dust settled on the racks like memory. No one asked why. Everyone knew. Guns had changed the shape of war. A musket did not care about skill. It did not weigh honor. It did not require 20 years of training. It killed from distance, without rhythm, without poetry. It ended men like punctuation marks. Katsuro had held one once. Felt heavy in the wrong places. Still, he did not despair. The samurai were more than soldiers. They were symbols of service, of selflessness, of restraint. Even if swords were no longer drawn, their presence still shaped behavior. But he also understood the truth. Symbols fade. One evening, walking through the town, he passed a group of children sparring with wooden sticks. He paused, watching. Their stances were wrong, their grip loose, but their eyes held a kind of joy. He approached, corrected one boy's elbow. The boy looked up, not with awe but with confusion. "Why does it matter?" the boy asked. "No one fights like this anymore." Katsuro smiled, but did not answer. Because the boy was right, and also wrong. It mattered because discipline mattered. Precision mattered. Even when the world forgot its use, form preserved the self. Later, in the garden behind the estate, Katsuro lit a lantern and knelt beside the pond. He looked at his reflection not as a warrior but as a bridge between what was and what would come. The samurai would not disappear in one night, but they were already ghosts in daylight, and perhaps that too was honorable. To leave quietly, without bitterness, like a final bow at the end of a performance, not because the actor was done, but because the story had moved on. The morning was clear. The air was crisp, touched with the sharpness of the coming autumn. Katsuro rose before the sun, as he always had, the body moving before thought, habit anchoring him more than memory. He bathed, dressed, tied his sash without ceremony. The motions were slow, deliberate. He knew, not because of pain. There was none. Not because of premonition. He did not believe in those. But some part of him, ancient, wordless, had accepted what the mind had not yet fully said. This would be his last day. He did not mourn it. He simply moved through it. First, he visited the dojo. The floor smelled faintly of oil and sweat. A single student, young, clumsy, determined, was practicing strikes alone. Katsuro watched him for a moment before offering a correction. The boy bowed, grateful. Katsuro said nothing else. He didn't need to. Next, he walked the perimeter of the estate. He spoke briefly with the gate guard, inspected the rice stores, nodded at the stables. He asked no new questions, gave no new orders. The systems he had built would outlast him. That was the goal. By mid-morning, he was seated in the study, reviewing one final ledger. He corrected 2 numbers, signed 1 scroll, left another blank. Then he stood, walked into the garden, and fed the koi. They gathered at the surface, mouths opening like bells without sound. The light caught their scales, flickering across the pond. Katsuro watched them for nearly an hour, not because he was waiting, but because he was ready. He returned to his quarters at noon and knelt before the household altar. He cleaned the incense tray, wiped the dust from the ancestral tablets, lit 1 stick. He bowed, twice. No words, no request, just presence. He ate his midday meal slowly, grilled fish, miso, 2 pickled plums. The same meal he'd eaten hundreds of times. He savored it as if for the first time. As if food, when accepted without hurry, became a kind of farewell. In the early afternoon, he opened the drawer in the rear corner of his writing desk and removed a folded cloth. Inside, a sealed letter. His will. It was short. A request for simplicity. A final list of names. No poetry. He had already written that. Then came sunset. He walked to the small hill at the edge of the estate, the one overlooking the village and the distant ridge beyond the river. He sat beneath a pine tree, legs crossed, back straight. The wind rustled softly. Insects hummed their evening song. He looked down at his hands. Scarred. Precise. Capable. They had held swords, held pens, held lives. And now they held only stillness. He closed his eyes. Not to escape, but to honor the dark. He did not die with spectacle. There was no drawn blade. No final breath marked by audience. Just the gradual slowing of breath. The body, having given all it could, stepping back into the soil. When they found him, he was seated as if meditating. A single pine needle had fallen on his shoulder. They did not weep. They did not panic. They bowed and carried him home. The estate did not collapse. No fires. No panic. No scrambling for control. Katsuro's passing was quiet, and so was the world that followed him. The next morning, a notice was posted at the gate, not in grand script, but with simple phrasing. Katsuro Dano has joined the ancestors. The house remained steady. There was no funeral procession. No banners. No drums. His will had been clear, no excess, no spectacle. His body was cremated at dawn. His ashes scattered at the edge of the koi pond where the wind moved with gentleness and shape, but his presence did not vanish. It echoed. In the early morning drills that continued in the dojo, the younger instructors quoted his corrections, mimicked his posture, spoke with his rhythm. In the garden, the pine tree he once sat beneath now bore a small stone, unmarked, smoothed by weather. Children were told not to climb it, not because of superstition, but because it was his. In the administrative wing, his ledgers remained open. Organized, every seal in place. The quartermaster remarked that it was as if he had just stepped out for tea. But he hadn't. He had stepped out forever. And yet the systems he left behind continued with eerie grace. That was legacy, not a monument, a structure. One of his former students, now a mid-level retainer, had taken over management of the militia. Another, now a teacher, copied his methods for training. His poems, found in a wooden box and signed, began to be quoted anonymously during seasonal gatherings. One line found its way into a shrine inscription. The blade is forgotten. The silence remains. The villagers whispered about him, not with fear or reverence, but with a kind of intimate respect. He had once resolved a border dispute without drawing steel, had personally paid to rebuild a bridge after a flood, had protected their harvest by intercepting a stolen shipment before it could be lost to corruption. These were not tales told in drunken bravado. They were facts. Measured, quiet, steady. His name faded from conversation after the first year, but his absence never created a vacuum. That was the true measure of his success, nothing unraveled. Not because he had been great, but because he had built something greater than himself. Katsuro had never fathered a child, and yet the next generation bore his imprint. Not in face, but in discipline. Not in voice, but in order. Not in blood, but in balance. Years later, during a particularly tense season of famine and regional unrest, the estate remained calm. While other provinces cracked under pressure, the systems Katsuro had helped construct held. One visiting magistrate remarked, "Who leads here?" The senior retainer replied, "Katsuro Dano." The magistrate frowned. "I thought he passed." "He did," the retainer said, "but he never left. The samurai no longer walk the roads of Japan. Their banners are gone, their castles repurposed. Their swords, once sharpened with ritual, now rest behind glass in quiet museums. The rituals have faded. The armor is ornamental. The names mostly forgotten. But the samurai never fully disappeared. Because the true power of the samurai was not in their weapons, their battles, or even their lineage. It was in the posture they left behind. A posture of restraint, of readiness, of service without ego. You can still find the samurai in silence, in structure, in the sharp line between impulse and discipline. They live in every act of practiced patience, every choice to endure instead of react, every moment where someone honors the invisible responsibility they carry. Katsuro was fictional, but his story is built from truths, composite pieces of hundreds of real lives lived with a code deeper than any single rule. A code that was never truly written down, yet shaped a nation for centuries. The Bushido, the way of the warrior, was more than a moral code. It was a frame, and frames outlive what they hold. Not all samurai were noble. Many were cruel, flawed, hungry for power. But even within those contradictions, the idea of what a samurai should be created a mirror. One that asked not, "What do you want?" but, "What are you willing to carry?" To be samurai was not to be fearless. It was to act in full view of fear. To be samurai was not to seek honor in death. It was to find humility in life. Even now, centuries later, the echo of their presence remains. In how people bow, in how decisions are weighed, in how certain words are spoken with pause, reverence, and measure. Not because of nostalgia, but because some patterns become part of the soul. We live in a different age. The sword has become metaphor. Armor has turned inward. But the need for clarity of self, of duty, of restraint is timeless. There will always be noise, always chaos. But as long as there is one person who rises before dawn not to win, but to serve, one person who sharpens themselves daily, not for show, but for readiness, one person who moves through the world quietly, with intention, with structure, with unspoken strength, then the samurai still live, not in blood, but in form, not in legend, but in example, and in that way, they are eternal. Thank you for walking this journey. If you found value in this exploration of honor, structure, and discipline through the lens of the samurai, consider subscribing to the channel. More stories are waiting from every corner of history. Like, comment, and share if this resonated with you. And remember, sometimes the sharpest sword is the quietest mind.